Okay, look, right, well, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction. So we've got about an hour and a half, and Nick's going to give talk, hopefully, for about 40 minutes or so, or perhaps a little bit longer, whatever. And we'll have half an hour for discussion at the end. So I was just saying, I'm not sure if Nick's, whether he'll confirm whether he's in the School of Sociology and Social Policy or Education. I'm sure he told me a while ago when I bumped into him that he'd moved from Sociology and Social Policy to Education, but he can confirm that. So I just want to give you just introduce him before he actually gives his talk. So how can we characterize him? He's been at the Nottingham at least 20 years or so now. He joined from the University of Sheffield. He did his PhD under Anthony Giddens. He's extremely interested in, I suppose he refers to it on his website as sort of cultural sociology, and he's very interested in questions of citizenship. He's written several books. If I can get my computer to work, I'll be able to scroll down and give you the titles. I'm not doing very well at the minute. No, it's just jammed up. Well, so I can't. We'll just have to let that go. But I assure you, he published a great deal. When I counted the articles, I stopped counting after a while. It's an enormous number of articles he's published, and several books on various aspects of cultural politics, sociology, and citizenship, and also on the media studies. He's extremely interested in media studies. And I'm sorry I couldn't give you the titles because my computer seems to have jammed up. So, okay, the title of tonight's talk is Social and Ecological Catastrophe in Late Capitalism, Herbert Marcuse, Negative Dialectics, and Critical Pedagogy. Nick's going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards. And I will make that go away, actually, if you don't mind, and then I can be able to see what's going on with everybody in the room. Okay, that's it. That will have to do. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Many thanks. Yeah, so let me just start off, I think, by saying where this talk has kind of come from, in a way, and then I'll kind of move on to try and sort of outline the substance of the paper that I've written on this particular sort of topic. So I'm not sure how it is in politics, but on the whole, an interest in critical theory, you know, as in the sort of Frankfurt School, in sociology in Britain is fairly unusual, actually. Normally, when I go to conferences and talk about this sort of thing, I'm normally the only person who's got interest in this particular kind of area. And it tends to be that in sociology, if you're writing about with class, it's kind of Bourdieu really that you're sort of interested in. I've got a book coming out about class next year, and I'm quite critical of Bourdieu for reasons I've got.
WhatsApp. Notes. Mail. No one ready.
Okay, thank you. I haven't got time to go into now. So it is that particular sort of tradition that I continue to be interested in. The first, as Tony has really alluded to, I've been around for quite a long time now in sociology. So the first publication I think I ever wrote back in the early 90s, which was about Habermas and the idea of the sort of public sphere, and more recently I've looked at work of Axel Honneth and people like that. But in terms of thinking about kind of ecological dimensions, it's been very much the work of Adorno, but mostly Marcuse, that I feel like I've been kind of drawn sort of back to. And Marcuse is going through, this may be news to you all, a bit of a revival, maybe not in the UK, I think, but particularly in the United States, there's quite a lot of interest there because, as you know, that the Frankfurt School relocated there to escape from the sort of Holocaust, and there's a sort of revival of interest in Marcuse, which I wasn't aware of when I first started writing about him, mainly because there's been a revival of interest in socialism more generally in the US, and there's been an exploration of Marcuse and the Frankfurt School that's kind of emerged out of that, I think. In terms of thinking about Marcuse in terms of sort of more kind of British sociology, it's, you know, Marcuse is not really very popular, I think, at the moment. He got a real hammering in the 1990s from sort of a sort of postmodern type critique, I suppose. And there was a very heavy criticism of Marcuse, which came from cultural studies, because basically they saw him as being disrespecting the sort of cultural consumption of, you know, sort of ordinary people, kind of looking down his nose at them. You know, that it became to stand for that, and it was a very sort of it's quite a shallow reading of Marcuse more often. Not, I lost count of the number of times in sort of cultural studies type textbooks, I just sort of they would all begin with some sort of, you know, sort of sideways swipe of Marcuse without really looking at his work sort of properly. But yeah, I think there are good reasons to be interested in Marcuse at the moment. I'm going to explain that sort of later. So it is kind of critical theory that I'm interested in, that particular sort of tradition. The other place I suppose I'm coming from is not so much as an academic, but as somebody who I've participated in, you know, kind of ecological type politics, political kind of issues more sort of locally now for about 20 years. And this is, I've been in things like Friends of the Earth, I've been in the Green Party, I was in Frack-Free Knots for quite a long time, and more recently I've been quite interested in the activities of XR, Extinction Rebellion. I've been to quite a lot of their sort of meetings, all of which has left me with a great deal of ambivalence, but at the same time, you know, a sort of need to sort of like try to link, you know, some of the scholarship that I've been sort of doing to kind of issues to do with social movements, and we ought to hear some of that kind of going on today. And I am going to say some things about Extinction Rebellion, particularly sort of later on. So hopefully, if you're not that interested in critical theory, you might be a bit more interested in them. I don't know, but I'll be very interested to hear what people have to say, you know, irrespective of all of that. Okay, so that's kind of how I've arrived at this. So I've got a long-term interest in issues to do with green politics, ecology more generally, socialism, etc., but also in critical theory as well. And I think, well, what to start with then? Why go back to Marcuse? It might seem like a really odd sort of choice, and say, if you were to look at, well, where is the sort of mainstream debates going on within sort of sociology in terms of environmental politics, there's an awful lot of writing at the moment that's around, you know, people like, I don't know, again, I don't know how familiar people are with this work, like people like Bruno Latour or actor network theory, or which tends to be a sort of like continual sort of deconstruction of the opposition between culture and nature, and to say you can't really finally sort of put things like the environmental crisis, it's cultural but it's natural, and to sort of explore that particular sort of that binary. And I must admit, I found myself becoming increasingly critical of that sort of stuff, because ultimately it has very little to say, more often than not, about political economy, which I think you do get from Marcuse. So yeah, I've kind of, yeah, so I'm a bit worried about where some of those debates have gone. The other thing I think that Marcuse raises, which I think is really interesting sort of politically, is you get a kind of, what you might call, well, I tried to call a sort of like civilization-based politics. But one of the things that Marcuse does is to ask questions about the possibility of a different civilization from the one within which we currently find ourselves. And this kind of inevitably emerges out of the, you know, the radical movements of the 1960s and so on. But there's something really quite interesting about that, and you know, this might be a good time to start thinking around those kind of issues. And for the obvious reason why that, I mean, hopefully everybody knows why somebody might be interested in some of those questions right now. That, you know, a couple of weeks ago, the head of the United Nations has pointed out that we're on the road to hell, you know, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to ecology. And if you were looking for a nice uplifting talk about the environment and I'm sorry, you've come to the wrong place, I'm afraid. You know, there are very good reasons to be extremely pessimistic of the sort of so-called business as usual kind of model. And you know, and I think that the first time I started thinking about XR, about my kind of Marcuse, I was on a bridge in London in, I think it was early 2019, and the big Extinction Rebellion protest was just beginning to sort of emerge. And what was really interesting, I found, was that you could see echoes of the 1960s in some of the things in which they're sort of talking about. This is sort of like reconnection back to that to that particular sort of period, which I find quite interesting. So Marcuse, what does he do? He focuses on, why do we need a different kind of civilization? Why is it that there's something really corrupting about kind of consumer capitalism, etc.? It's to do with the violence of capitalism, which is evident in the kind of boredom and alienation of factory work, or the moronic nature, as he calls it, of kind of mass culture, and the eco-destruction of consumerism more generally. And I think there's enough there to start sort of trying to think about that and trying to sort of take him sort of seriously. Now, the other thing that's quite often missing, I think, in appreciations of Marcuse is just how, like as a sort of Jewish intellectual that had to escape the Holocaust, just how influenced or haunted maybe he is by the Holocaust. So it's very rarely does he actually mention the Holocaust, but it's actually there in almost everything he says, because like what he's being haunted by more often than not is firstly that fascism could actually reinvent itself, that it could occur in the United States and so on. You think that it was an established liberal democracy, but he'd already seen fascism establish itself in sort of Germany, and he was very skeptical of the idea that ultimately that was ever going to be a break enough to prevent those sorts of things to happen. And secondly, there's this haunting, I think, that comes from the sort of the Holocaust. Ultimately, that human catastrophe has occurred once, or is lived through twice, maybe in the First World War as well, and it can happen all over again. And this is one of the things that is there in his kind of ecological writing more often than not. So there's a sense of when Marcuse is writing of a civilization that's haunted by the potential for its own self-destruction. So there's quite a lot of worry about nuclear weapons, but there's also this sort of concern with a kind of ecological destruction that could sort of take place. So there's no discussion of climate change or anything like that, but there are kind of echoes of that, I think, in his writing. And within all that, one of the things he does, I think, really quite interestingly, is to talk about this most famous book, if you know anything about Marcuse, is One Dimensional Man, is the prevalence of what he calls kind of one-dimensional thinking in society more generally, which really what he means is positivism. He means the sort of like the idea that things can be fixed by different forms of technology, or they can be fixed by a kind of scientific form of rationality. And he's really critical of all those sorts of things. So it's not surprising maybe that Marcuse, when he did become popular in the United States in 1968, and he wrote this book which became a sort of bestseller, that this was a period when people were really concerned about the kind of, it wasn't so much that violence the violence of the system was being concealed any longer, because people could see it on their television sets. By this we mean the sort of war in Vietnam, the development of the countercultural movement, and all the rest of it. So not surprisingly, he became one of the kind of prominent philosophers of that kind of particular sort of period, much to his surprise. I think he was in his 70s when he wrote One Dimensional Man. So yeah, and I think that there are parallels between that particular period and now. Of course, it's not exactly the same, but there are things which there are interesting parallels. So we have, if you like, this sort of a critique then, which you also get in the ecological movement, of the sort of sheer emptiness of a life of consumerism. You get the critique of kind of ecological destruction, a critique of the idea that capitalism could ever be sustainable, which again is I think a question that's worth sort of asking. One of the things that Marcuse writes when he writes about ecology is the sort of not only the kind of mountains of waste that capitalism produces, but also the idea that ultimately things are made to break. They're not going to last very long, because if you make durable products, then that's not good for the economy more generally. So and again, I think that all of those aspects are around at the moment in the ecological kind of movement, and also were raised by the anti-globalization movement, and so on and so forth. So again, all these things I think maybe attract a kind of Marcusean type analysis. There's also the emergence of what you might call a kind of anti-enlightenment critique, which is sort of emerged on the sort of far right as well, which again would have been very familiar Marcuse, just the rejection of critical forms of rationality altogether, the deliberate lying, the deliberate forms of deception, and so on. These are all things that Marcuse would have understood. There would have been nothing new, I think, for him there. So what about his writing then on ecology? What about his writing on critical pedagogy, on education? Now, at this point, you have to admit, I think Marcuse didn't write a lot about education, more specifically, although it's kind of there in all of his writing, I think. There's implications for education, but there is a concern about it. So he's concerned, for example, that consumer capitalism provides has a form of education written into it. So by education, he doesn't just mean what's happening in the education system. He means how people become educated into being certain kinds of beings, having certain sorts of thought patterns, accepting a certain version of normality. So, reality television is a form of education, or like watching a consumer kind of program is a form of education for Marcuse. But he also wrote about kind of schools and universities, and he thought that actually, rather than say some of the other radicals of the 60s who, some of you will remember, Ivan Illich, who I still think is a really kind of interesting sort of figure, who wants to get rid of schools altogether, although they later claim he didn't say that, but that's kind of the implication that most people took from his kind of writing. The Marcuse wanted to sort of like, to re-establish the role of critical thought in schools, in universities and so on, and to speak up for what he called a kind of critical education, which he felt was being driven out by what he called kind of positive thinking, which is linked to his critique of sort of positivism and instrumental rationality more generally. And one of the things that's interesting about Marcuse, he writes about the idea of negative thinking being important. And I must admit, when I first came across this phrase, I really liked that, because in a world we're always being told to be relentlessly positive, and Marcuse is telling us to be negative. And what he means by that is critical, is to be critical of the world that we see around us. And he argues that in the history of education actually has been about restricting more critical forms of education to a particular elite, to making sure there's something really dangerous about critical thought, that to restricting it, from the vast majority of people, just to allowing an elite to experience what a critical education might be like, because and he says that actually there's lots of things which are constantly trying to limit critical thought. One will be ultimately the fear of what a more kind of humanistic way of thinking might do, and where it might kind of lead people if they really had a sort of more critical education. And secondly, he's aware of what he continually calls the sort of anti-intellectualism of his time, the anti-intellectualism of kind of mass culture. And for all the problems with the ways in which maybe the Frankfurt School do write about mass culture, and there are some problems in that respect. There's no doubting, the anti-intellectualism, I think more often not, the times in which we kind of live at the moment. Okay, it's worth kind of pondering that. But so he wants to sort of like explore the dialectical possibilities of education. And one of the things he writes about in one of his essays on education, I always think it's quite interesting, one of the arguments that got Marcuse into quite a lot of trouble, which I think is again worth revisiting, he's saying, well, there's a problem around the idea of tolerance, right, which he raises, which is quite interesting. He says that what you need really is a sort of what he calls a discriminating tolerance. That is, if you like, there shouldn't be tolerance of things which are clearly destructive. There shouldn't be any tolerance of that. There shouldn't be any tolerance about what he calls demonstrably aggressive or destructive movements. And he basically kind of argues that kind of liberal capitalism has this sort of like, by preaching sort of tolerance, basically we're there just like, so, oh, well, someone disagrees with me, even if, what they're proposing or what they're sort of arguing for is the kind of road to hell. So he's worried that ultimately the tolerance leads to indifference in the end if you're not careful. It's not that he wants to sort of drive out intellectual disagreement. I think quite often he was understood to mean that. He was quite clear in a lot of his interviews that is not what he kind of means. But what he's worried about is the idea that of a sort of general sort of what he calls the passivity of tolerance that it can kind of encourage. It's that he's sort of concerned with. So why is he so bothered about that? He basically, his argument there, I think, is that ultimately he says, and again in the interviews, these things are not so much in the books, is that fascism could have been stopped. It could have been stopped. The problem was people looked the other way, they tolerated it. They thought, well, these are just people who see things differently from me, and so on. And he basically says, well, it could have been stopped if people hadn't tolerated it. And that's one of the things this is one of the things he continually sort of returns to. You also see there's a very strong critique of vocationalism as well in his writing, which is also an attempt, he thinks, to limit the critical possibilities of this more sort of humanistic kind of education. I must admit, I always quite like that argument, because whenever you hear people talking about vocationalism, and I say this as somebody from a working class background, it's never for the elite. Okay, they're not going to have a vocational education. It's always for the working class. Okay, these are the people who need to, be learning how to labor, kind of thing. So that kind of fits into his argument more generally. In all of this, I think he's quite similar to. I just want to bring out for a moment here about how he might differ and be similar to Adorno. Adorno wrote, I think, a really interesting essay on education and the Holocaust. And one of the things that Adorno kind of pulls out of is the need to protect or to restore the critical kernel of education. And he kind of writes in this essay about how authoritarian regimes will always declare war on critical thought. It will always declare war, or it will foster a form of indifference to violence and cruelty and suffering more generally. There's a certain sort of in again Adorno's writing there. There's a kind of machismo that came along with fascism. He thinks that critical thought, should have been allowed to sort of interrogate more generally. They do differ. So they're both kind of, if you like, proposing a sort of idea of kind of critical thought being a sort of thinking against the grain, if you like, of the dominant society. And that this being, for Adorno, if you read Negative Dialectics, there's a sort of, there's a really strong sense of the sense of thought, the capacity, thought needs to be critical of itself. There's a kind of never ending, almost always alienated capacity of thought to be alienated from the sort of dominant society. There's never a sense in which, if you were an Adornian, you'd be able to sort of like start proposing a future better society and so on that may well end up looking like a blueprint, etc. Because the idea of thought more generally is that it would be have a form of alienation from the dominant society. Whereas I think that Marcuse does try in some of his writing to speak of kind of more hopeful sort of alternatives, to try and imagine what a world might be like beyond instrumentality and so on, beyond the kind of instrumental logic of kind of capitalism. So he's a little bit different in that respect. So okay, so why then Adorno? Why Marcuse? Well, I think that why now? I think the other thing I would take from Marcuse, which I'm really interested in, and again I think this connects to some of the things I'm going to say later about the kind of ecological movement more generally, is the importance of what he calls consciousness change. And I think that is really quite key at the moment. So there's a sort of like idea at the moment that ultimately, by just slightly adjusting our world, we'll be able to deal with something like climate change. Whereas Marcuse, I think, is quite interesting because he's kind of saying, well, actually, domination is produced not just by economic relationships, but it's also produced through culture. And if you're going to kind of have, get people to think differently, they're going to have to, if you like, there has to be changes in people's minds, in their experience, in the ways in which they see the world more generally, okay? If you like, the ways in which they perceive the world is going to have to be shifted in one way or another, okay? And I think that is really valuable in what he's kind of saying. So when Marcuse calls for this sort of like revolt against the established order, what he's asking for is a revolt against this sort of idea that the working class or the workers are just seen as these instrumental objects to be used and then thrown away by capitalism, but also that nature is also seen in those sorts of terms. So to coin a phrase I heard recently, that when a capitalist looks at a forest, what does he see but a way of making money? Okay, that for Marcuse is the road to hell, you know, if you like. That's the road to destruction. So that when it looks at nature, it sees an object to be manipulated, to be seen, what use can we make of this, what money might be made of this, or to be moved out of the way when it gets in the way of your plans for things. This will inevitably produce a kind of anti-ecological society for Marcuse. And to recover, you know, in all this is, and again, this is what makes him different from other Marxist writers on ecology, I think, is Marcuse writes an awful lot about the recovery of what he calls a sensuous connection to the natural world. Okay, that is really important. So that you then start thinking about how to build a human civilization that's built on happiness, on well-being. These are all sort of central categories for Marcuse to try and explore. But none of this is possible without a kind of revolt against the consumer society more generally. The argument is that to build what he calls a kind of qualitatively different society, something that kind of feels like something quite different from what we've got at the moment, where people, and again, this is a quote from Eros and Civilization, another one of Marcuse's works, where people are just simply kind of incapable of shoving somebody else into a gas oven, if you like. That this is it's just incapable of simply looking at the natural world and seeing it in kind of really instrumental type terms. There's sort of like there'll be a kind of moral and cultural revulsion against treating people or treating nature in those sorts of things. So I think there's something quite interesting in all of that. You don't have to agree with me, obviously. So like think about dominant debates around climate change. Okay, now here I'm leaving out the outright deniers. I'm leaving them to one side. Okay, we can talk about that if you want, but we'll just put them to one side for now. Just think about the mainstream debate about climate change more generally. It goes, I think, something like this. That ultimately the problem is there's too much carbon in the atmosphere. We can calculate all of that. Okay, we can find out how much carbon there is, and we can replace it with different energy sources to drive down, you know, the amount of carbon that there is there, and this will then have, you know, a really good effect in terms of the planet, and it will end up saving the world and all the rest of it. Now, you know, that works up until a point, because what's not mentioned in any of that, so there's a kind of instrumental logic that goes into that, is number one, the vested interests which are invested in, you know, like actually destroying the planet. That doesn't seem, that is not mentioned in any of that. Okay, and secondly, there's no idea about having to rethink your relationship with nature at all. Okay, in any of that, it's just a kind of matter of sheer sort of calculation. Okay, what's missing from all of that is any sense of the need to shift kind of consciousness, yeah, because ultimately everything I said just then about climate change, you know, basically conforms to the dominance of the business as usual model, which ultimately is not working. So in this then, there's a sort of like, what I'm taking from Marcuse is there's also a need to reconnect to a kind of more utopian type tradition. So where you start thinking about, well, you know, beyond the so-called realism of the present that we happen to be in, okay, that starts to, you know, we are going to need to find our way out of this. We're going to need our imaginations to start thinking, well, how actually could we live differently? Okay, and rather than just thinking, well, we somehow just got to, you know, slightly adjust, you know, the ways in which we live. What Marcuse is quite useful for, I think, is to think, well, how could we live differently? How could we live differently from the ways in which we currently living? And he doesn't provide you with a blueprint as to how to get there. If you're looking for that, he's not very good, but he certainly asks the question. And in that, we will need the sort of utopian tradition, I think, where we can think about alternatives, where we can, if you like, value, which I know is not very highly valued at the moment, because immediately you start talking about this, people start accusing you of being unrealistic, okay? Where you can start value kind of speculative thinking, which was greatly prized by the sort of Frankfurt School. So, okay, so in all of that then, okay, you then think, well, okay, so how is this kind of this sort of thinking? Where will you find it? Where would you find the search for kind of alternatives and so on? Where you certainly wouldn't. I mean, yeah, okay, so one level you can say we're still in a world, I think, that's dominated largely by mass culture. Okay, and that argument was heavily critiqued at the time, but actually, you know, if you just look at kind of social media, it's full of the sorts of things that the Frankfurt School were worried about. It's full of superficiality, it's full of climate deniers, it's full of, you know, a kind of, you know, like people who don't want to sort of like face up to the sort of the world that we're in at the moment. Or not surprisingly then, there's this sort of mental health crisis amongst you young people, because there's a sort of collapse in the idea of anything better that might eventually kind of emerge. So is it the case then, if that's where we are, is it the case then that you just go back to Marcuse then? Is that right? He could sort of solve all of our kind of problems. We just need to reinvest in this kind of particular way of kind of thinking. Well, not really. Okay, would be the answer to that. So obviously the sort of like writing of Marcuse and why it connected to this sort of cultural rebellions of the 1960s, we find ourselves in quite a different position now. Okay, there's no point saying everything's the same, because it's not. Okay, there are some things maybe to re-rescue from this, but not everything, I think. There's a sort of idea that, you know, in the 60s, there was a sort of idea you get from Marcuse and in a lot of the writing around there was a kind of rebellion. Why did his writing catch on? Because there was a sort of rebellion against a sort of society of what Marcuse at the time called surplus repression. There was a sort of like, people were, you know, by this kind of puritanical sort of culture, there was a sort of, and long hours spent on the production line, there was a sort of anti-pleasure element, you know, in all of that. And, you know, I'm not quite sure that's where we are now. We're living in this sort of like culture of surplus repression. Franco Berardi's work, I think, is really interesting at that point. Again, I'm not sure how well known he is amongst people who are here, but never mind. He kind of argues, and he's very sympathetic to Marcuse and trying to kind of think about different sorts of civilizations and so on. But he kind of thinks that, well, you know, actually today is not sort of built upon the surplus repression, again, and kind of anti-pleasure type discourse, but it's more built on the sort of like the continual simulation of desire. That's more where we are now. That's how kind of consumer capitalism sort of works. You know, sort of like, you know, it's like that you're continually being told you need to desire things, you need to want things, you need to, you know, you need to consume, etc., etc. And, you know, also like people's lives, not so much ruled by monotony in the way in which Marcuse is described, you know, like working on the assembly line and so on. And it's obviously he's thinking about the kind of capitalist West here, but more about the kind of anxiety around precarity more generally. And actually, says Berardi, it's been this sort of collapse of any kind of idea of, you know, the future could actually be better. And I think for Marcuse's period, there was a sort of time in which people thought about the future, even if they're on the radical left or on the right and so on, that there was a sort of sense in which you could realistically expect the world to become better in the future. Whereas there's been a kind of collapse in that sort of thinking, not surprisingly, because if you ever ask anybody about the future now, they'll just tell you it's all going to be worse than it is now. It's all going to get much, much worse. And again, I'm not surprised that that people, you know, find there's a sort of depressive sort of reality, if you like, that gets inscribed within all of that. Also, you might also say Berardi also says the younger people who were the ones who were driving the sort of counterculture along, today they're much more likely to be suffering from mental health problems, addicted to their phones, or literally sort of trying to sort of survive. So we're in a kind of different period now, right? But it's not to say some of the questions that Marcuse asked are not still quite important. Am I right in thinking I've got 5 minutes? That'll do.
Sorry, just unmute myself. Well, it's 20 to 7. 10, 5, 10. You could do.
Okay.
If you wanted 10.
Okay. Well, we'll see how I get on that.
Yeah.
Not too much more. Okay. So where would you look then for the re-emergence of this kind of more utopian strains of thinking? Where would you look? Where would you find all of this, maybe? I think it's certainly worth having a look. There's strong Marcusean flavor to a lot of the writing that comes from sort of the degrowth movement. I don't know, again, how familiar people are with that. So it's the idea there is to try and build a society where people consume much less, where they work much less. But it would also mean not like the Green Deal, which could be, you know, I'm not against that. It could be an important sort of step, and you know, very important step. But you know, there's a sort of focus upon like degrowing advertising, degrowing SUVs, degrowing long distance travel, degrowing forcibly, hopefully, fossil fuel. That the kind of well-being of society shouldn't be just measured by the level of GDP, etc. And there's a sort of like critique of a culture of sort of speed, overwork, hyper consumerism, and so on. All of these things have strong Marcusean type flavor. So there's a beginning of a trying to imagine what a different world actually might be like, given, you know, the sort of skepticism you might have about the possibility of just simply reforming what we've currently got. Okay, so I think it's certainly there. Okay. The second place is in certain social movements, and I just want to talk a bit now about Extinction Rebellion. Now, I noticed that one of the things I mean, I would agree with the idea, and again, this is a strong Marcusean type flavor. There's no sustainable future, I think, without some pretty sustained opposition to the ways in which things are where we're currently going. Okay, that we've known about the impacts of climate change for a very long time now. I mean, I think I remember reading my first book about global warming in when was it? Let's think. It was in 1992 when this was sort of this was a book called The End of Nature that I read, and I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. I wasn't aware about that. So we've known about this for a very long time, and yet, you know, what we seem to be in is a situation where, well, we'll have, you know, capitalism can produce some of the alternatives, but at the same time is producing some of the destruction as well, and it will carry on doing that. I think there's no real way out of it if you're just going to rely upon the sort of economic system, and that has become increasingly apparent to people. I think that there needs to be a real radical rethinking about how we should live, how are we going to live more generally, and the sort of complete unsustainability of the current sort of system. And so I think there's no kind of future in a sense that's, you know, like, or that's going to be, you know, a sort of humanistic future without the sort of disruption of the present. And I think Extinction Rebellion have got that right. And I was in ecological movements for long enough to know that just campaigning on this one issue or asking people to do something with plastic, or there was one movement I didn't even mention where, you know, one of the things we were trying to do was to persuade people to walk to school, for example. Okay, I remember that quite clearly. We gave the kids little badges if they were walking to school, and we got some of the local schools kind of involved in all of that, and so on. And then I remember on the day this happened, that the parents simply just, rather than driving them all the way up to the school gate, they just dropped them on the corner, so it looked like they were walking to school, you know, kind of thing. You know, this sort of piecemeal type, you know, sort of approach. I'm sorry, I mean, I've seen enough times when it just is so flawed. It is very unlikely to have the impact that we're kind of looking for. So I think XR are right to start asking questions about, you know, the sustainability of the civilization that we happen to be within. However, from a Frankfurt School Marcuse type perspective, it's problematic though, because at one time there was a very heavy strand of XR that went something like this. It was very instrumentalist, that ultimately, how are we going to win? We're going to win by maximizing the number of people that we get put in prison. Okay, and you know, I heard it, you know, I went to lots of meetings when this is what I heard, that we need to get as many people in prison as possible, and once we got a certain percentage of the population, you know, who have been, you know, challenging the law and so on, and potentially, you know, going to be put in prison, then we will win our arguments, and we'll get, you know, the future that we like. I went to a lot of meetings where I heard that. Thankfully now they've moved away from that, that sort of instrumentalizing sort of positivistic type arguments here is very, very problematic. And also I'm happy to talk a bit more about this later, people interested. It's very, very manipulative, the ways in which it was used as well. I was incredibly, I criticized them and so on, but it was very, very problematic, the way in which that was used. It was a sort of instrumental agenda that went on within that sort of particular social movement. However, the more positive, other than the sort of disruption, and we can have arguments about the tactics that are used and so on, and whether they've got that right and so on. I certainly think there's no different future without disruption. I think that's right. But there's also a very strong emphasis in the movement itself on consciousness change, and again, that's not far away some of the time from the kind of hippie culture that Marcuse would have been sort of was engaged with, if he was also critical of it as well. So in Extinction Rebellion, there's a very strong sense of the kind, what you might call the ecological self. Okay, so the idea there being that ultimately what we're taught to be is kind of individuals, and that this really just sort of cuts us off from one another in a sense of our empathetic concern with each other, but also with the environment as well. Okay, and that what happens within, and this is very strongly linked to a kind of green spirituality as well. And again, I often get into trouble for bringing this up, but I'll keep going with it because, okay. And some of that can actually be pretty powerful, actually, in terms of changing the ways in which people think and what they feel sort of kind of connected to. And there's been, like workshops I've been to where people are being, dealing with their feelings, which is quite interesting. So again, it's not just a case of campaigning on particular groups of issues and having a sort of instrumental agenda to sort of, they're trying to sort of change people's consciousness as they sort of go on. So I've been, again, workshops where people are listening to people talking about their grief around what's happening to the environment. And it's interesting, one of the things that's very, as you participate in these works, very evident is that people are much more affected by these things than they're often aware, that their own sort of feelings about what the future is going to be like, what it's going to be like for their children, but also what it's going to be like for other people as well. And so there is an attempt to sort of shift consciousness in that respect. So again, I think that's quite interesting, and I would sort of defend quite a lot of the work that they do in that particular area. There's a sort of there's a lot of interest in sort of animism that you get within XR, but also with Buddhism and so on and so forth in that respect. I tend to kind of build a more kind of connected self, if you like, in relation to nature and in terms of other people too. So I found all that really quite interesting. So also then, so I'm going to finish off now, just to go back to Marcuse for a second then. What is he, why him? Why go back to this? I think that one of the quotes I quite like from Marcuse is the sort of sheer emphasis he places upon the imagination more generally, and we're going to need a lot of that to try and imagine a different future. And he says at one point, the poet is the total non-conformist. In this, you get a kind of attempt to envisage a possible future for us all beyond what we can kind of see going on at the moment. And within all this, we're going to need some versions of, alternative forms of kind of education to get people to imagine quite a different world from the one in which we're entrapped in, all of which I think relates back to his particular legacy. Thank you.
Brilliant. Oh, that's great. Thank you very much, Nick. That's fantastic. So we've got plenty of time for questions. Hamdan, I can see you've got your hand up. So, and then perhaps Andreas. Hamdan first. It'd be great if you could switch your camera on, Hamdan. I don't know if... but it's okay if you can't.
I think, Tony, that was actually the applause sign.
Oh, was it? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought he had his hand.
But Hamdan may nonetheless have a question, so I don't want to prevent Hamdan from asking. Yeah.
Okay, my apologies. No, well, go ahead. I can't see. I thought it was a hand up to ask you. Right, good. Andreas.
No, it's all right. Thank you. Actually, a question arose to my mind.
All right. Okay. I'm done.
With regards to climate activist groups. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Professor Stevenson, for the extraordinary speech. With regards to the climate activist groups, with the current pace that they are active, that they're conducting their activities on, don't you think that they might evolve negatively, in which they use methods that harm their cause, their noble cause, instead of persuading people to support them? Especially with the recent incidents that some of these groups have taken.
Do you want to answer that?
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think that's right up to a point. So I have noticed that, however, that when groups like XR are being mentioned at the moment, the one thing everybody knows about them is that, oh, you know, this is what I'm hearing, you know, like through the mainstream media is, oh, they prevented ambulances getting through, they've they've inconvenienced people and so on. And there you might question some of the sort of tactics around sort of roadblocking and things like that. Okay, there is an issue there. But also, I think, however, I would also argue that some of the targets that they have, you know, like if you watch the kind of media, some of the places they have targeted, like oil companies and so on, that they seem to me to be perfectly legitimate. And this is a kind of non-violent form of protest, which at the moment is being, you know, kind of criminalized by the government. You know, they're sort of like, they're more worried about people gluing themselves to buildings than they are about the kind of future that's being passed on to sort of people. So yeah, again, I would say, however, I'm sorry, but there's no real nice way to do it. There's no, you know, like, oh well, you know, like, you know, a kind of Habermasian approach would be simply, you know, it's sort of like, okay, let's have a discussion about it through media, let's exchange views and so on and so forth. Whereas I really think that this is something that does require direct action. I think that is right, and that you know, that the world is in now such peril that this is the sort of thing that is going to be called for. What I don't like, however, is what I tried to describe earlier, is the sort of the emphasis I found, you know, particularly in 2019, much less so now, around trying to manipulate people into doing that sort of work, yeah, okay, as sort of like getting arrested and so on. I went to one talk where somebody who was a very leading figure in Extinction Rebellion started telling young people they had no future anyway, so they may as well go to prison, and that prison was really like a library. The people, he actually said this, and I was so appalled by that. I kind of stormed out and started trying to argue with him later, and or I did my best, but yeah, I mean, that was, I don't think that's there in the same sort of way. But yes, you're right. It may well be that the government are simply going to try to criminalize them, and just as it did in the miners' strike, and say, oh, these people are really bad. They're actually terrorists. We should keep away from them, and so on. Because actually, you know, to some extent, then that suggests to me that some of the things that they're doing are working. Okay, and that some disruption is going to be necessary, sadly.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually.
Thank you.
There's a tradition, isn't there, of non-violent direct action, of course, that they draw on. Actually, your remark at the end there about the terrorism, I've forgotten about that, but of course they have officially, in inverted commas, been characterized in the past, have they not, as a terrorist organization?
Yeah.
Okay, so I've got Andreas and then Sinem. Andreas first.
Actually, Sinem had her hand up first.
Oh, did you? Oh, I'm sorry, Sinem. Sinem first then, okay. And then Andreas.
Of course, Tony. Okay, thank you very much, Professor Stevenson. It was really an interesting issue. Recently, I'm making some readings about ecofeminism and some ecological, you know, feminist approaches. That's why this subjects make me interested a lot. Well, I took some notes, but I'm not very, you know, close relation with Marcuse. I'm not very well know him, but What I thought that while you just try to understand this ecological catastrophe in the recent time with the Marcuse reading, and you also mentioned that the importance of pedagogy and civilization through pedagogy and education. But also in my recent readings, I realized that we also think the issue from patriarchal capitalism. This is not because I'm feminist, but because it's the issue that the core problem, yes, the education, yes, the important, but in the pedagogical, or education system, there should be also and the gender equality is very necessary, because it's all, all the wars and all these, many of the investments and this kind of energy investments, everything is done by men. So I start to think of the case from recently, it's a sort of, new social movement, is a kind of new social movement, or you can read it from the fourth wave feminism, some people argue. So I started to see the case for more on patriarchal capitalism from that, and that's why I was thinking about one of your words that you underlined a lot, surplus repression. I read the surplus repression is very much, interwoven with the social reproduction. It's very close to social reproduction, because also women is repressed and oppressed by men, and also at home they are unpaid workers and their, labor is not counted, and that's also a sort of surplus, another alternative surplus repression. That's why I just wanted to learn here what would your opinion about this patriarchal capitalism approach in today's world, and because it's a transforming of the ecology is also transforming the female selves, and that's why female became more conscious about these ecological issues. That's why while I was listening to you, I just took some notes, and it's always I directed to from the feminist meaning of it. Just you can find it's all very, very much patriarchal. So I would like to listen what you think of this.
Yeah. Okay. So that's very interesting. So I just want to answer the question in terms of Marcuse's work, if that's okay. So in terms of Marcuse's work, surplus repression has a very specific meaning, which he writes about in Eros and Civilization. Okay, so what he's doing there is he's taking the work of Freud and trying to think, kind of a bit more critically with it. So like Freud has this sort of idea that ultimately to have civilization, you have to have a certain level of repression more generally. Okay, so otherwise, we'd be just I don't know, lying in bed all day or getting into fights, or we couldn't control ourselves. It needs to be some kind of superego, which is the wider society, which is going to be there to sort of like to kind of hold us in place. Whereas for Marcuse, what he says is basically is that Freud remains a fairly kind of bourgeois thinker, because what he hasn't thought about is the ways in which repression also comes from living under a particular sort of social and economic system. Okay, and that ultimately what the system itself requires a huge amount of repression, instinctual repression, just simply to get people to go into factories and to do their labor and to do their jobs and all the rest of it. Okay, so he kind of thinks and it's a sort of anti-pleasure sort of ethos, people not being able to enjoy themselves and being really repressed and etc., which is required to maintain capitalism. Otherwise, how on earth do you think people survive being on an assembly line? It's kind of what he's getting at. And if you move to a society which is much less repressed in that respect, where people were not controlled and regulated in that sort of way, that they didn't work really long hours and then come out and then consume loads of sort of like media, which was like really quite ephemeral or very repetitive and so on, then you'd have this huge sort of like swelling of cultural production. I think for Marcuse, people would become sort of with the adequate forms of education, is very, very positive about all of this sort of stuff. So they become poets, they become cultural creators in all sorts of different sorts of ways. They were not bound by this particular sort of civilization. So I mean, that book comes from a kind of sort of before Marcuse is really engaged with feminism. Later in the late 60s, he describes the feminist movement as the most important social movement of the period. Okay, and it's fairly unusual in terms of the kind of male new left for that time. On my read, there are new left thinkers who kind of nod at feminism, but Marcuse actually writes about it and engages with it in ways which are quite unusual actually for that particular time. And he thinks that this is a hugely significant movement because on the one level, it's going to be really good for to have a sort of critique of the dominant model of masculinity is going to be really important, because ultimately there's an awful lot of violence that's generated by this particular sort of model, if you like. And secondly, there's a sort of like an upsurge in anger about women and the objectification of their bodies and so on and so forth. And there's a sort of rejection of all of this, which again is a form of instrumentality for Marcuse, and therefore something to be sort of kind of applauded. So there is an engagement with feminism, and there are overlaps, I think, between Marcuse and a form of eco-feminism, I think, which you've sort of you kind of talked about. But he's engaging with a feminism at a particular stage, I think. So yeah, that's right. I think that there are overlaps between what you're saying about kind of patriarchal capitalism and some of the things that he starts sort of thinking about. And in the paper, I tried to make some connections with eco-feminist writing, like people like Carolyn Merchant or Silvia Federici as well. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, so there's connections between them, but I'm afraid I didn't have time to bring those things out. So many thanks for making those points.
Thank you, Sin. So actually, before Andreas, before you ask your question, can I abuse my position and just chip in a little bit? Sort of, so one particular text that towards the end of the 60s, I think, is this essay on liberation, isn't it? Which about 5 years after One Dimensional Man. He addresses this issue there in that particular essay. So I think the idea of polymorphous sexuality is a sort of core concept for his argument. So I mean, I think you're absolutely right to associate Marcuse with utopianism and the utopian tradition, and there are different aspects of that, and certainly an emphasis on the creative imagination is part of that. But also within the utopian tradition that he's drawing upon, of course, there is this attitude towards sexual liberation and the role of women in the utopian society of the future. So that goes, well, it actually goes back, doesn't it, to Kollontai and Marx and Engels, but particularly Charles Fourier. Charles Fourier is very strong on this side of things. So Marcuse is actually working within a well-established tradition of thinking.
He is, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, and I agree with all. That's all correct. Yes, I mean Fourier comes up in his writing a great deal. It's a sort of romantic, critical romantic tradition, really, if you like, that he's kind of connecting back to, which has kind of gone out of fashion, I think, a little bit. So. Okay, sorry, my apologies, Andreas. You've been waiting patiently.
No problem. Thanks a lot, Nick. That was excellent, fascinating, stimulating presentation. Just a couple of brief points. So if you compare it with the late 60s, which in a way you do when you pick up again on Marcuse, could one say perhaps, or is that exaggerated from our current position, that these crises have intensified in comparison to the late 60s? And it was interesting what Simon said about patriarchal capitalism. Yeah, there's a crisis, I would say, in global gender relations. And actually beyond that, I think there's also a crisis in global race relations, which intersects. And we have this kind of, where people talk about capitalism being also racial capitalism. There's we are in a conjuncture where these crises come together in quite a powerful way, which ultimately does threaten the very survival of humanity. And of course, the ecological crisis is perhaps the most visible reflection of that. And then perhaps the second remark is when you refer to, okay, so where do these alternatives come from? So Marcuse, as you said, focuses more on the utopians. I think actually, and your reference to degrowth society, I think is a good degrowth literature is a good reference to current thinking in along these lines. But perhaps as a Marxist, I would focus also on the concrete experiments people are engaged with. And there are all kinds of experiments, on the one hand, at the local level. In Beeston, we've got the kind of incredible edibles who just start planting food on public land. You could go through a park and suddenly there's a food growing patch. That is not going to be the major change, but I think that's a kind of a concrete experiment. And what are the alternatives? There are a lot of autonomous Marxist experiments where people try to live differently and create this kind of utopia already in the present. And then, of course, there is XR, which I think, with all the problematic points, there are one which take that kind of struggle to a next level. I would say Black Lives Matter. Who would have expected that? Yeah, you never know when these moments erupt. So even if it doesn't look very concrete, this may erupt at certain times. Fridays for Future. There are a lot of alternatives in indigenous thinking around water struggles. So there's a whole range. And I think actually while the crises are intensifying, perhaps we can also say that actually the struggles are intensifying, and this government legislation trying to make protests or to limit the right to protest stuff shouldn't be too noisy, could be disturbing, shouldn't disrupt the traffic flows. I think that's an indication that it's not just intensification of crisis, but actually also an intensification of struggles, and that there are alternatives. And perhaps that's the only thing, in a way, we can hold on to as a way forward. But I would locate the alternatives in concrete struggles and experiments, perhaps rather than in the kind of Fourier kind of utopian writings of the perfect society.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I also think that there's, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with you there. I'm not sure about the intensification of it, because it's sort of like, you go back to the 60s and you read the literature of that period, there's also a very strong sense that, you know, this is also a period where there's a kind of overlapping sense of crisis, which is building, you know, around the world. So struggles against authoritarian regimes and government, struggles, you know, like the streets of Paris, struggles, you know, the anti-war movement and so on. There's a sort of real sense of intensification in that period as well. And it's worth thinking about, well, what happened to that during that period? What happened to it? And Marcuse kind of argues that what kind of happens is that some of this becomes incorporated into the system. Yeah, okay, some of these struggles become, you know, there's a sort of loosening effect that sort of takes place. So it's sort of like, well, you know, we need to allow some liberation for women more generally, or we need one of the great gains Marcuse writes about the New Left in the 60s was the struggle for green spaces. Okay, so he talks about, you know, there was this sort of like real struggle that went on in the 60s, which was practical, the sort of thing you're talking about, which he says, well, this was one of the kind of gains of this period, that people wanted to have parks to go into, they wanted green spaces, they wanted places they could kind of relax, etc., etc. So there is an element of him, I think, isn't just utopian. I think he's also aware that some of these things, yeah, particularly the, you know, like when he writes about feminism, some of these things have kind of concrete gains that he writes about. But he also says that there's been an attempt as well to kind of, you know, after this incredible period of, you know, all these questions being asked, all these kind of mass movements and so on, to kind of incorporate them back into sort of society. So you get the kind of commodification of, you know, feminism, or you get the commodification, or the I don't know, the Black Panthers are reduced to being a logo on a T-shirt. So it's partly there's some movement there. There's a sort of like, you know, the bits that can, by the system can seem to be acceptable, but at the same time, the way in which you incorporate it back in is to sort of like, you know, is through sort of commodification more generally. There's a very interesting book by Nina Power. I don't know if anybody else is. She didn't write about one-dimensional man. Her book's called One-Dimensional Woman. Yeah, and one of the things she points out is that in the, I don't know this because I can't speak German, but like in the original German, that the word that Marcuse meant one-dimensional people, whereas it got translated as man. And she makes this point in the book. But like, this is one of the things that she talks about there, is that the ways in which feminism became contained by a certain sort of neoliberal kind of sort of rhetoric, which focused upon equal rights for people. And this is some of the ways in which the system was able to kind of loosen itself a little bit, and then was able to turn feminism into being a sort of commodity. It was no longer dangerous any longer. And you can already see some elements of that around the sort of ecological movement as well, the ways in which some of the demands are being kind of incorporated back in, like we need to make different lifestyle choices, and maybe the individual, it's all about the sort of culture of the individual and so on. So but it's most radical. There's a sort of system critique that's there as well. So yeah, I don't disagree that what Andreas is saying is about there's a sort of intensification of different sorts of crises which are emerging at the moment, rather like the 1960s. Whether or not we have built the same level of social movements, mobilization that we had in the 1960s, and there's a sort of like pushing various governments to sort of crisis point. Well, I mean, I don't know how that's all going to kind of play out, because there's another version of this that's also in the back of my, sorry, I know this is a very long answer, I just want to say one more thing and I'll be quiet. So there's also in the back of my mind is thinking, well, how actually could you make the current system sustainable? Because there's a very strong sense from Marcuse that you simply couldn't do that. It just wouldn't be really possible to make consumer capitalism sustainable. And I read an article not long ago where there was a sort of idea, well, what the West could do is say, well, it could opt a kind of neo-colonial type approach. It could say basically very strong borders, lock out the sort of dispossessed of the world as they're they can't grow food. There's all these climate refugees, lock them all out. You can do that, and then sort of like blanket cover the Sahara Desert with solar power, but the power all comes back sort of here. So it's like a way of, there's a sort of neo-fascist response, which maybe something like that could work. And you then end up killing millions. I'm not advocating this, but I'm just wondering whether or not that's a feasible approach. That if you really didn't want to change things that radically, that you could end up going down that line. You couldn't do that without huge amounts of resistance, I think. But at the same time, that may be an approach that we begin to see more of. So yeah, so I don't know whether or not I'm undecided about that. About whether actually it simply is not possible. I mean, I'm just thinking that there was an old argument, wasn't there, about socialism or barbarism, and I think that we could productively resurrect that in the context of these sorts of crises, I think.
Thank you very much for that, Andreas. Now, Joe has put an interesting, rather long comment in the chat. I wonder, Joe, how do you feel about just sort of saying something rather than having me read it out? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So yeah, yeah, it's a very long comment. Sorry. So I had this thing about in one-dimensional man. Let me put my camera on. So in Marcuse's one-dimensional man, he seems to suggest that like new labour process technologies of management and control means that the working class is no longer necessarily like a radical agent of change. And Berardi, who you mentioned in Soul at Work, draws on that to talk about how often struggle over the wage and the wage relation is seen as sort of lacking in about the administration of capital rather than any radical content. So I was thinking about that in sort of like modern context where we seem to be seeing a sort of re-emergence of more sort of workplace struggles alongside sort of the growth of climate activism, and wondered sort of who you might envisage this political subject that's going to sort of like challenge climate catastrophe might be, and whether you see that being sort of like a working class led movement that challenges sort of labour exploitation and exploitation environments or simultaneously. Yeah, I think that's what I was trying to put. Sorry for the very long comment in
No,
the chat.
that's excellent. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there are some things. I know I've been speaking up for Marcuse today to some extent, but there are some things he just gets wrong, I think. So one of the things, he completely overstates the extent to which, that the working class have been brought into capitalism, and that they're all very happy with these sort of consumer goods and so on. And there's a real lack of understanding as to why it might be, for people who've had long periods of, not being able to do, living in very austere sort of social conditions, as to why consumer capitalism might not, at least at first, appear to be that problematic. Think, well, you can buy a house, you can have a car, you can go on a nice holiday, etc., etc. And he really radically underestimates or doesn't think through any of those particular sort of dimensions. But to answer your question as to what will be the struggles that whether or not the struggles of labor and the struggles of because at the moment there's a real strong sense, isn't there, that ultimately these things are completely different or are not interconnected, that there's a sort of there's a driving of a wedge continually between the environmental movement and the sort of labor movement. On one level, there's the labor movement, which is there because basically, the cost of living crisis. I don't have to rehearse any of that for all the people who are here at the moment. Okay, and people really desperate and concerned with their sort of livelihoods. And, these are seen as being more often than not sort of working class struggles. And then on the other hand, you have these I don't know, what they called, tofu. What was it? Sylvia Brabham called tofu munching, middle class kind of hippies. I'm trying to remember the speech that she gave about this. And these are all the well-heeled and kind of thing. And none of these people are sort of working class. And in fact, the working class are the people who are being prevented from getting to work, aren't they, by these roadblocks and all the rest of it, massively inconveniencing everybody. Yeah. So yeah, there's a real which is interesting in itself. There's a real attempt to drive a wedge between those two groups. I think there is a sort of fear there that what might happen if these groups started to overlap and to interconnect with one another. So and I'm not saying I agree with this, but I do think it's interesting. And so I presume people here are familiar with Mark Fisher. In Mark Fisher's writing, one of the things that he kind of quite often alludes to but doesn't explore is the sort of fear within the ruling class that what would happen if the working class started to sort of become hippies or started to become interested in peace and love and explore some of the sort of elements of the kind of counterculture. What would happen there? What would happen to working class culture? Having been brought up to labor, and that was your kind of worth, and to work, and all of that. What would then happen to kind of radical sensibilities around that? So I can't. It's a fool's game to sort of predict the future, but I just note that there's a systematic attempt to separate the two movements, I think, and there's no reason why there can't be more kind of. My hope would be maybe like what you're suggesting here, is that the two movements become much more sort of interconnected through ideas around eco-socialism. And so on, but yeah, there's a continual playing on a kind of cultural antagonism there, though, isn't there? Yeah.
Thanks for that, Joe. That's really interesting. So, anybody else like to chip in, ask a question or comment? No. Well, we have about. Oh, sorry, Andreas. Yes. Go on. Yeah.
Perhaps just a comment to follow up on what's just been said. There is this movement, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, and they do try to bring those different sides together and try to, in a way, have also some manufacturing trade unions as part of them, try to alleviate this kind of fears that actually moving towards green energy and a Green New Deal means joblessness for us. And they say, well, transition can only happen if that also includes material well-being for those which might lose their jobs in the first instance. There needs to be a future for them. And so I think that there are attempts to address these kind of confrontations. And whether that works out or not is, I would say, struggles are always open-ended, but there are some positive moves made in that direction.
I mean, that's very interesting. And there are also some Marxists who are kind of arguing that it's really problematic to have a critique of consumption, particularly after a period of austerity, and that really there needs to be a much more of a focus on the workplace production more generally, and particularly workplaces which are involved in kind of coal production or oil production or things like that, and that it's those workers that we really need to be able to sort of target. I mean, I've read that a few times now. I think that I've got some sympathy with that, but the problem is I think that the idea of a critique of consumerism as well is still pretty important. I would kind of argue that one of the places that Marxism is weak, and doesn't mean to say it can't be developed, so I'm thinking here of Kate Soper's writing. One of the things that she points out, I think, is that actually there is a politics around consumerism. There is a politics where we can think about maybe how we would live differently with less. And that Marxism historically has not been that strong in that particular area. It doesn't mean that it can't be developed. And I think that's partly why I find that Marcuse is still quite important, actually, because we are, despite austerity and all the rest of it, that if you ask people, the sort of like normalized model about how it is most people would see their, would like to live, and in a sort of celebrity culture, etc., is that, well, to be successful is to have a lot of things, is to be able to have beautiful foreign holidays, to have a nice house in Spain, to have 300 pairs of shoes, a gigantic house, etc., etc., etc. That still is the sort of dominant dream, which is still kind of being normalized. I think the minute you turn on television or you turn on sort of have a look on social media, these are the sort of like ideas about what a successful person, how they would live, kind of thing. And I think that it's still pretty important to ask a lot of critical questions around that and the normalization of that dream, because ultimately, as we all know here, it's totally impossible for the whole world to enjoy a life of that. I noticed in Aaron, I don't know if anybody here has read Aaron Bastani's book on luxury communism. One of the things that I found really troubling about this book was sort of suggesting to you that this sort of life of total kind of abundance was all actually possible if we only use the sort of technologies in the right sort of way. I think that's really, really problematic, because this is the very thing that we need to be starting to think about how to unhook ourselves from. I mean, it's full of other absurd thoughts as well. Now I won't mention those, but yeah. So yes, I mean, these movements, it would be good if they are more interconnected and so on, but they're both asking legitimate questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So anybody else would like to ask a question or comment? It's 25 past, so I think perhaps if not, perhaps we should. Andres, you've got your hand up again, I see. Go on.
I don't want to colonize the moment.
No,
a couple of minutes. So just one, I think one of the biggest problems is the massive inequality. We see that in the UK, but we also see that in other countries and across the world. And Alan Simpson at the moment at the university has this weekly lecture on how to confront the climate crisis. And I think he made the important point that actually it's the poor are not to pay for the transition. Yeah? And he said, well, there are some people who actually still need to grow. And I think certain countries in the global south who contribute so little to global warming, there's space for them to grow. There's some very poor people, perhaps in the meadows in Nottingham. They should still be allowed to grow. Yeah. And so that's then the question we need to say, well, there's a certain people, the consumerism to describe is totally beyond their means and possibility. Yeah. They even struggle to heat their homes. And I think perhaps if we finesse that a bit, and tackle this big inequality, that's an important step towards getting to a more general position from where we can then challenge this consumerism, with which I would agree.
yeah, and there's also, yeah, I think that's right. And it's also worth making the point, isn't it, about that the people with the very largest carbon footprints are the very wealthy. You know, it's the global 1% who are living these entirely unsustainable kind of lives. It's that really that needs to be degrown. That's true, but then it's also the case that a lot of the, in terms of a sort of politics around the imagination, as I was trying to suggest, that a lot of it is about how it is that we see ourselves, how it is that we understand ourselves, okay, is also very much there within our culture, and that really needs to be quite seriously questioned. I think the degrowth arguments are really quite powerful in that respect. But yes, of course, there's people who cannot participate in any of that and feel themselves to be cruelly locked out of those sorts of things, and to tell them that they need to degrow is really sort of problematic. So yeah, I'd accept that.
Okay, thank you, Andreas. Well, I think perhaps yeah, perhaps we should draw it to a close. Thank you very much, Nick. That was really interesting. I enjoyed that tremendously. I'm sure everybody else did as well. Yes. I can't see anybody, but I'm sure they're all applauding. Right. Okay.
I believe you. I believe you.
Well done, Francis. Thank you. So, and Graham's got his hand up anyway. Great. So I've got to stop recording.
So yeah, I particularly like to say thank you to all for listening.